dangerous criminals that are still on the loose, or at least were never caught. If you're a Trust Me Bro fan, then you would know that this list is only going to get more dangerous and more evil as the list goes on. So let's get started. On a chilly November day in 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper hopped on a Northwest Orient flight from Portland to Seattle. And he looked like any other traveler in his neat suit and tie, but Cooper had a wild plan up his sleeve. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to the flight attendant revealing that he had a bomb in his briefcase, and he demanded $200,000 cash, 4 parachutes, and a refueling truck waiting for him at Seattle. As the plane touched down, the drama unfolded quietly. The authorities, though shocked, met his demands, trading the cash, parachutes, and fuel for the release of 36 passengers. Cooper kept a few crew members on the flight, and they took off again, aiming for Mexico City. Once again, shortly after takeoff, high above the remote forests of southwest Washington, under the cover of night, Cooper made a bold escape. He strapped one of the parachutes onto his back, secured the money, and jumped out of the plane through the aft door. The plane eventually landed without Cooper, kicking off a massive manhunt. Despite extensive searches and a lot of speculation, Cooper vanished, leaving behind only a few clues, including a decaying package of $5,800 found years later by a boy near Columbia River. As you likely already know, or probably assumed by the title of this video, D.B. Cooper was never caught. I wanted to start this first segment with a story rather than just saying D.B. Cooper. 1, because the story is just so interesting, and 2, because I wanted to try a new format. What do you guys think? But if it wasn't already obvious, the first entry on this list is D.B. Cooper. D.B. Cooper is likely the most famous entry on this list, and he's also the most tame entry, meaning that his actions, although dangerous and scary, were not nearly as evil as compared to the other entries on this list. But I still want to take a deep dive going into the exact danger that D.B. Cooper put people in and the effects that this could have had if things went wrong. Okay, for starters, this was a literal hijacking on a commercial flight with 42 total people on the flight, 36 people including Cooper, and then also 6 staff, 2 pilots and 4 flight attendants. Now, it is my assumption that D.B. Cooper did not actually have a bomb, and then that was just a bluff to get the authorities to comply with his demands. But if he did have some makeshift homemade bomb in his briefcase, things could have went a lot differently. For starters, if the bomb was made poorly, it could have detonated on its own at any point, causing all 42 people to die on this plane, assuming that the plane doesn't crash over top of people and kill more people. That alone would have been catastrophic and a huge tragedy. Now, fortunately, as we know, that wasn't the case, but what did inspire D.B. Cooper to put so many people's lives in danger? Well, like we mentioned, money. He requested $200,000 cash, which in today's money is equivalent to $1.5 million, which is no small sum of money. Now, whether or not you would act on this elaborate scheme to try to get $1.5 million is up to you, but personally, I have no interest in doing anything of the sort. And one thing I find kind of ironic is that D.B. Cooper was smart. Every part of this plan was calculated and executed perfectly, which leads me to believe that he was a smart and competent individual. I say this because with the skills he had and the planning he had, I don't doubt that he could have made this money honestly. But my assumption is that he must have had some sort of incident happen in his life to make him do something so crazy, which I would love to know that story, but I doubt we ever will. Anybody who's willing to hijack a plane, risk the lives of others, and steal money, in my books, is definitely dangerous. And in the eyes of the law, a criminal, which is why I added D.B. Cooper to this video. But honestly, Cooper was kind of a class act when it came to being a criminal. He didn't make a scene on the plane to scare any of the other travelers. He allowed all of the passengers off of the plane. Many of them didn't even know what was going on. He only kept a few staff members on the plane. One of the flight attendants on the plane said that he wasn't cruel or nasty at all and that he seemed confident and nice even. And once he got his money and parachute, he was gone. When he opened the aft door of the plane, the pilots even called back to him on the PA system and asked him if he needed help. And his last words were no, and we never heard from him again. So although I do not condone the actions of D.B. Cooper whatsoever, when it comes to dangerous criminals, I think that he went about it in a very interesting way, which is no doubt why his story is so famous and which is why I wanted to have him on this list. This, in my opinion, is probably the best case scenario when it comes to a plane hijacking situation. But let's keep going. Next up on our list, we have one of the most notorious gangsters of all time and one of the most elusive criminals in the entire world. He is known as the boss of bosses, and his name is Simeon Mikhailovich. If you're unfamiliar with Simeon, you're not alone, and this is likely because Simeon is not an infamous American gangster that's been portrayed in movies. He's not even American at all. He's of Ukrainian, Russian, and Israeli descent, but that doesn't mean his resume is any less qualified, or should I say blood splattered. I want to make very clear that I am not hyping up this person in any way, shape, or form. This person is not a good person. I'm simply speaking with emphasis for storytelling purposes. With that being said, let's get into some of Simeon's credentials. For starters, the nickname Boss of Bosses was not a self-given nickname. The government agencies of the European Union and the United States described Simeon as the boss of bosses of most Russian mafia mafia syndicates in the world. And he is believed to be directing a multi-billion-dollar international crime empire. And he is described by the FBI as the most powerful and dangerous gangster in the world. Oh, yeah, and if that's not enough, he was literally in the top 10 fugitive list from October 23rd, 2009, all the way till December 17th, 2015. But after hearing all of this, you might be asking yourself, what did this knucklehead get up to that got him in so much trouble? And let me tell you, this is the exact list of charges that put him on the FBI 10 most wanted fugitive list. I'm reading this directly off Wikipedia. Fraud by wire, racketeer, influenced, and corrupt organizations act conspiracy, mail fraud, money laundering conspiracy, money laundering, arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, human trafficking, aiding and abetting, murder, smuggling, prostitution, securities fraud, filing false registration with the SEC, false filing with the SEC, falsification of books and records. And I'm sure there's more. So as you can tell, this guy's a little bit of a goofball. And I'm sure you probably noticed in that list there was prostitution. And I'm sure it means something else, but I think it's kind of funny to imagine this guy selling some ass when times were tough. But honestly, I can't judge. You gotta do what you gotta do. And if this channel goes under, I might have to do the same. Mogilevich did a lot to acquire so much wealth, but one of the first things he did to start making money was trading foreign exchange currency, or forex, which at the time in the USSR was illegal, which he was fined and charged for, and this is likely the catalyst that got him involved in organized crime. A lot of the wealth that he controlled came from a lot of high-level corporate scams. One of my favorites including a publicly traded company on the Toronto Stock Exchange. YBM Magnex Incorporated was a publicly traded stock on the Toronto Stock Exchange, which in only a short amount of time was able to grow by over 2,000%. Seemingly a promising company and a great investment opportunity. But that can be further from the truth. Mogilevich used his economics degree and deception to forge numbers in the company's accounting, making the company seem like it was growing substantially when in reality it was just laundering money. The headquarters of this company was raided once Canadian journalists caught on that these Russian mobsters were involved in this company, and the day after the raid, the company's stock became worthless almost overnight. I'm sure there was a few savvy investors who weren't too happy about this. It goes without saying that with somebody so influential, so powerful, and so rich in the organized crime world, there is no doubt that they are absolutely a dangerous individual. And because this video is focused on criminals and not killers, I figured I would keep the crimes I focused on pretty diverse. But if you are waiting for murder stories, the next entry is for you, but be warned, it is gruesome and extremely upsetting. The final entry on this list is a serial child assaulter from Australia. He is only known by the nickname Mr. Cruel. And his story is nothing less than evil. Now, if you've seen a few Trust Me Bro videos, then you would know that we use the word assault to reference something much more evil and disturbing. Something that YouTube wouldn't like me to say, and something that I honestly wouldn't like to say either. Mr. Cruel haunted Melbourne, Australia during the late 1980s and early 1990s. He's infamous for his calculated and sinister attacks targeting young girls in their homes. The way he operated was chillingly malicious. He would break into the family's homes at night, often while the family was still asleep. He would abduct, assault, and then later release the victims miles from their homes. He did this on 3 separate occasions to 3 separate victims, and the time that he kept these victims varied from 18 hours all the way up to 55 hours before they were released. What really set Mr. Cruel apart from other criminals with similar intentions was the fact that he had such a methodical approach to avoiding capture. He wore gloves and a mask, making sure to leave virtually no forensics evidence behind. He also took measures to confuse the police, like bathing his victims to remove any traces of DNA before releasing them. He literally thought of everything to cover his tracks, including instructing the kids not to look at him and using a very monotone voice to keep his voice generic and unrecognizable. The case that he is most known for is also the most tragic and is one that is still kept a mystery: the abduction of Carmen Chan in 1991. Unlike his other victims, Carmen was never returned home and was found deceased a year later. And unfortunately, after this case, there was absolutely no more evidence about Mr. Cruel or this case. Despite massive police efforts, including Operation Spectrum, which was specifically launched to catch just Mr. Cruel, he has never been identified. The case remains one of Australia's most troubling mysteries, not just because of the crimes he committed, but also the fact that he is still on the loose today. I don't think there's any debate or any further detail required on why Mr. Cruel is such a dangerous criminal, and it's truly upsetting and disturbing that he was never caught and justice was never served. Just for context of how slippery Mr. Cruel was, when the Spectrum Task Force was created in May of 1991, over the next 3 years, the police searched 30,000 homes, interviewed 27,000 suspects, and spent a total of $3.8 million and still collected no meaningful evidence. To this very day, there is still a $1 million reward for any information on Carmen Chan. In a lot of cases that end up going cold and unsolved, it's very easy to blame the police for negligence, but in this case, it definitely doesn't seem like there's a lack lack of trying, which in my opinion makes this case much more scary and much more upsetting. But with that being said, let me know what you guys thought of this video. I typically only cover killers, but in this video I wanted to cover criminals and make the video a bit more dynamic by including different types of people on the list. Let me know what you thought. Also, let me know what you thought about the story-based segment at the beginning. Did you like the storytelling and visuals on screen? Your input means a lot because I want to make videos that you guys enjoy. And the last thing I'll say is, if this is your first Trust Me Bro video, why not subscribe? We make really cool videos and you'll probably like it. Trust me, bro. Peace. The worst times to be born in human history. You might think you have things pretty hard right now, but if you have a roof over your head, access to clean water and electricity, and people around you that care about you, you've got a lot to be grateful for. A lot of the modern luxuries that we take for granted today didn't even exist 100 years ago, which just makes you think, if almost everything I enjoy right now didn't exist 100 years ago, what did life look like 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago? Well, in this video, we are going to dive into all the worst time periods to ever be born into. Everybody knows that the Roman Empire fell, but not many people talk about the time between the Roman Empire falling and the beginning of the Middle Ages. This period of time is referred to as the Late Antiquity, and it is a major time of political instability and a huge power shift in global politics at the time. Late Antiquity typically refers to anywhere from 200 AD to 700 AD, but for this section specifically, I'm going to be focusing on like 450 AD to 700 AD, because following the official end of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, a lot of things continued to happen and change until the end of the Late Antiquity in the beginning of the Middle Ages. Whenever there is a large change in almost any aspect of life, there is growing pains associated with it, because change is scary and difficult. And in the context of the Late Antiquity, anybody living in the Roman Empire was experiencing a huge cultural, political, and spiritual shift that had not been seen realistically for hundreds of years. This topic is undoubtedly extremely complex and nuanced, but I'm going to do my best to provide as much context as possible to describe why this time period would have sucked to be born and live in. And one of the biggest reasons for a lot of the hardships that people faced during this time was the widespread political instability, specifically because the empire that had controlled and mismanaged the entire geographical area for the last hundreds of years was no longer, meaning that by default, there was a power vacuum that people were hungry to fill. And of course, with the fall of one of the most iconic empires of all time, you also lose a lot of long-standing institutions, specifically armies, defense, banking, really anything that provided safety and stability to the people of Rome. Even before the fall of the Roman Empire, Rome was consistently under attack from different groups. But during the Late Antiquity, there was much less resources and manpower to fight off barbarian tribes like the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, which meant that these barbarian tribes were extremely motivated because they knew that the big bad Roman Empire was not what it used to be. And what this resulted in was frequent wars, raids, and destruction across all of Europe and the Mediterranean, which for soldiers was devastating because at this point, soldiers were not as well equipped as they used to be, meaning that they were typically at a disadvantage during these attacks. And for civilians, that meant that they were simply less protected, making them vulnerable to barbarian raids, which is something you definitely do not want to be vulnerable to. On top of defenses being diminished and wars and raids being more frequent, there was also a huge economic decline, which was almost perfectly coupled with the political instability. And because of this, massive trade network shrank. Major culturally significant cities were destroyed and abandoned, and even agriculture was affected due to these consistent invasions. We think about ancient Roman and ancient Greek ruins today as this thing that existed only far in the past, but during the Late Antiquity, major Roman and Greek cities and institutions and buildings that were active and respected only 100 or a few hundred years ago were now in ruins, with the majority of these culturally significant locations either being destroyed in raids, left to rot because there's nobody to use them or maintain them because of the city's depopulation, or if these buildings were still in decent shape in a city that was somewhat populated or repopulating, a lot of these buildings were actually deconstructed from the inside out to be used for new buildings. For example, ceramic and bricks were taken from old antiquity buildings and used to build new churches. The Late Antiquity is an interesting period of history because it is regarded as one of the most transitional periods, as it was at the dawn of the rise of Christianity. And because of that, there was a lot of conflict surrounding other religions in the area. But for that reason, a lot of people see this time period as an opportunity and as something to be celebrated. And while that is definitely something to consider, the Late Antiquity is one of the most significant examples of transitioning from the old world to the new world. And living through that was not easy whatsoever. But in case you're still not convinced that the late antiquity is one of the worst times to be born in and alive in, allow me to present one thing I haven't mentioned yet, the Justinianic Plague, which took place during the peak of the late antiquity, specifically from 550 AD to 750 AD. And this 200-year period saw a drastic decline due to this plague that took place all across the Mediterranean and was responsible for the death of tens of millions of people. This plague was happening while all of this political uncertainty was happening, all of these wars and raids were happening, all of the economic decline was happening, and all of the religious chaos was happening. All of this at the same time as a deadly plague. So yeah, the late antiquity is not just a casual handoff of power or an example of growing pains, and had a lot of horrible things happening at the same time. And for that reason, I thought it was a great candidate for this list. But we have a lot more to discuss, so let's keep going. Following the late antiquity, I want to discuss a period of time that's a bit more modern. What I'm about to discuss isn't necessarily a time period, it's just a stretch of history that you would not want to be born in or live through at all. And this includes anywhere from 1914 to 1945. The first thing you're probably thinking about during this time period is the World Wars. And you're exactly right. World War I took place from 1914 to 1918. And during this time, if you were a healthy adult man, there was an extremely good chance that you were going to be sent into some of the worst hellish conditions ever imaginable. But we're just getting started. Obviously, World War I didn't only affect soldiers, as there was millions of civilian casualties as well. And it's estimated that in total, just from World War I alone, 15 to 22 million people died, with 9 to 11 million of those being military personnel and 6 to 13 million being possible civilian deaths. And that doesn't even account the injured and the displaced. But we're still only getting started. The conditions of World War I were insane. Trench warfare, machine guns, poison gas. These people did not have a quick and painless death. The people that did die died in some of the worst conditions this world has seen. But to add insult to injury, during 1918, not only was there a massive world war going on, but there was also a huge Spanish flu pandemic. And this pandemic was one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. And terrifyingly, sometimes killed young, healthy people in as little as 2 days. It's estimated that the Spanish flu killed at least 50 million people worldwide. Keep in mind, this is after 22 million from the First World War that just happened. Both of these major global events were extremely and almost unspeakably devastating. But we're still not done, because following World War I and following the Spanish flu pandemic, we find ourselves at the end of the 1920s, specifically 1929, when we began a time known as the Great Depression. During the Roaring 20s, most Western countries experienced massive economic prosperity and also had a huge social and cultural change post-war. But this cultural change was for the better, with a vibrant and optimistic outlook on life and the future, and everybody was making money and feeling better, and everything that was horrible and bad was behind us, right? We survived one of the biggest pandemics of all time and one of the worst wars of modern history. Of course we have something to celebrate. The bad times are behind us and everything is better, right? No. And the worst was only yet to come. 1929 was the catalyst of the Great Depression, and the Great Depression lasted through much of the 1930s. The Great Depression can be summarized by its economic, social, and psychological effects that it had on basically all of America. But it wasn't just America that was affected. This was a global economic catastrophe, and millions of lives were changed forever. At its peak in the United States, unemployment rates were as high as 25%. Businesses were closing left, right, and center, banks were failing, and because people lost their jobs, their savings, their livelihoods, and everything that they knew to be normal, people needed to adjust quickly or die. Poverty, hunger, homelessness were all extremely common during the Great Depression, as well as breadlines and soup kitchens, which were basically the government giving you rations of food, which typically weren't enough, but they helped. And it's not hard to believe that with this huge economic collapse came personal and political unease and restlessness. Any social programs that existed were now gone, which meant that the most vulnerable groups in society were now even more vulnerable. Old people, children, disabled people, anybody who wasn't fully and extremely self-reliant was now at risk. But even if you were self-reliant, there was still a huge psychological impact of this entire situation. Just imagine if 5 years ago you were experiencing the most prosperity you had in your life. You survived the plague, you survived the war, you had a business that was successful. It seemed like everything was okay. But then in October of 1929, everything changed. The bank where you stored your millions of dollars was closed. Your money was nowhere to be found. The business that you were operating was now empty because nobody was shopping, and you had to fire all of your employees.
The close network of friends that you had around you was now dissipating because people were ditching town to find any sort of opportunity elsewhere. And you are left in a house that you're going to default on with people that you need to take care of, and the only option you really have is to get in the breadline and hope for the best. If nothing else, that's going to do something on your mental health. And we've even seen the effects of people who experienced and survived the Great Depression in future generations. During the Great Depression, people globally were uneasy. Everything that they felt they had worked for was taken from them. It was gone. And now most people are jobless, homeless, or at least hungry. And basically everybody was doing way worse than they were before. And this social unrest led to political unrest, which led to the rise of some pretty crazy ideologies. Which brings us to the last thing I want to mention in this period of time during the early 1900s, the Second World War. As I stated earlier, the First World War is one of the most catastrophic things to happen in recent history. And the Second World War, unfortunately, was just as bad as World War I, if not much worse. The Second World War lasted longer, experienced much more death, experienced genocide, and so many more horrible things that weren't even possible during the First World War. Just for context, it's estimated that anywhere from 70 to 85 million people died during World War II. And it's believed that almost half of these deaths were civilian deaths, which is extremely upsetting. The Soviet Union alone lost 24 million people in World War II, which is more than all of the people lost in World War I, just for context. And once again, if you were a young, healthy man during this time, there was an extremely good chance that you were about to be exposed to hellish conditions and almost certain death. And if you were just living in Europe or Japan, there was also a good chance that no matter who you were, old, young, man, woman, you could very much so experience horrors beyond your comprehension. And the bookend on this entire period of time is the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima that ended the Second World War and killed around 200,000 people. I just described a handful of some of the most significant historical events in modern history, and all of these things happened in like a 40-year stretch. If you were born in 1898, you could have been old enough to fight at the end of World War I, experience the Spanish flu pandemic, lose all of your money in the Great Depression, and then as an adult fight in World War II as well. And by the time World War II ended, you would be 47 and have a lot of stories to tell. It's honestly just mind-boggling to think about, and for that reason, I knew it was one of the worst time periods to be born into and live in. I wanted to take a quick break from war because we've discussed a lot of it up to this point, so I wanted to talk about the year 536 AD, which is a year that, ironically, has been nominated as the worst year to be alive by Michael McCormick, who is a medieval scholar. And by medieval scholar, I don't mean he was a scholar in medieval times. I mean like he is a modern-day scholar of medieval times. Regardless, what happened in 536 AD? Well, if you paid attention to the first section, a lot, because 536 AD actually does take place during the late antiquity. But I didn't want to discuss it in that section because I wanted to make sure I had a separate spot for, well, a volcanic winter. During 536 AD, a massive volcanic eruption took place and literally cooled the Earth's climate, specifically Europe's and China's climate. And for 18 months, across China and Europe, there was a dark sky consistently, temperatures dropping as low as 2.5 degrees Celsius. And because of that unusual decrease in temperature during these 18 months, people not only experienced severe weather anomalies, but also widespread famine. But on top of both of these things, I can only imagine how scared and concerned people were, because this volcanic eruption happened in Iceland. So people in China and medieval Europe really didn't know what was going on. They just saw clouds that came and never left. And the results of these clouds were devastating. And while we don't exactly know how many people died due to the famine and political unrest that were caused by the volcanic winter of 536 AD, this entire situation was basically just rubbing salt in the wounds of what was already happening during the late antiquity period. And I don't want to harp on the late antiquity so much, but let's just kind of recap. Consistent wars and raids, famine, economic collapse, a massive bubonic plague pandemic, and on top of all of this, a year and a half where the sky was just darker and everything was colder, which caused people to get really weird and squirrely, food to die, and weather to get weird. Like, for example, in China, it literally snowed during the summertime. Following 536 AD, there was something known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which lasted from 536 to 660, because after this 18 months of the initial cloud dust that caused a volcanic winter, there was other eruptions that happened shortly after that prolonged the cooling of the Earth at this time. So even though 536 is the year that gets all the fame, there was roughly a 130-year period where the Earth was just colder, and it was literally known as a Little Ice Age. Ridiculous. Fast forwarding out of the late antiquity period for the second time, we're now moving on into the mid 1300s when medieval Europe is in full swing and we are now experiencing one of the most devastating pandemics of all time, the Black Death. In all of Europe and even areas outside of Europe from 1347 to 1351, basically nobody was safe from one of the deadliest pandemics to ever happen. Now, we've already discussed the bubonic plague that took place during the late antiquity period, but I had to discuss the Black Death because it was so culturally significant and it was so devastating. So I'm going to make this part short, but I had to mention it. During this roughly 4-year period, the Black Death wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of all of Europe's population, which is almost unfathomable to think about. In numbers, the death toll is estimated to be around 50 million in Europe and up to potentially 200 million globally. Like, let's just say it killed an average of 50% of people in Europe. That means 1 in 2 people were killed by the plague in only a few year period. That is so hard to even imagine. And on top of the sheer terrifying nature of half of the people that were living now dying, there's also massive social and political impacts because of the Black Death, adding gas to the fire of this already out of control situation. And it's for that reason that being alive during the mid 1300s would be one of the worst times to ever be born or live in general, because everybody was terrified of the disease that was going around. Nobody knew how to properly treat or prevent this disease. Half of everybody you know is dying from this disease. And if you were to be born in this setting, it must have seemed like the world was just ending around you. And for that reason, it's more than obvious why you would have not wanted to been born or live during this period of time. And seeing as disease and pandemics are inescapable on this list, I do have another example to discuss. And it takes place during the late 1400s. But this is a time that is specifically tragic for a specific group of people: Native Americans. Europeans decided to take a trip over to America, and it ended in 95% of all indigenous populations effectively being wiped out, because Americans were immune to and carried diseases that the Native Americans have never seen before. But it wasn't only the diseases that made the colonization of the Americas so devastating for the Native Americans, but it was also the social and religious and cultural aspects of the entire colonization by the Europeans. If you were a Native American living anywhere in North America, basically any time after 1492 was a really tragic time to be born and alive. As I mentioned previously, when the Europeans began to colonize Americas, the spread of old world diseases such as smallpox led to one of the deadliest biological disasters basically ever recorded. It's estimated that up to 55 million or 95% of Native Americans passed away just from diseases alone. But that's really where the suffering began. If you were an indigenous person during the time of colonization, not only did you experience the widespread disease, but also widespread violence, displacement, and essentially destruction. The Europeans at this point already had gunpowder, and now they realized that they had an unintentional bioweapon that they could use at will. And because of this, many indigenous groups were simply at the mercy of the Europeans that were colonizing their land, which meant that people were moved out of places that they've lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Wars took place on people that were already weak and had low morale, and the entire Native American way of life was not only in jeopardy, but on the verge of being destroyed forever. The settlers and explorers from Europe that were living in the Americas didn't have an easy life either. But compared to what the indigenous people experienced during this time, it's not even comparable. And keep in mind, these European explorers and settlers, they chose to embark on this mission. The Native Americans didn't ask for any of this. They were living their own life until the Europeans inserted themselves and brought over germs and steel. And even to this very day, you can still see the effects of this colonization on Native American communities. The colonization of the Americas is another example of an extremely harsh and tragic transition period that happened throughout history. And for better or for worse, it happened. And to have lived or been born as a Native American during this time, it would have been extremely hard and tragic. And for that reason, I had to put it on this list. And for the last time in this video, I actually wanted to discuss an entire time period. And I saved it for the end because it might not fit the criteria for some people, as this time period is prehistoric. And it's also pre-human. It's known as the Carboniferous period, and it took place from 539 million BC to 299 million BC. And while humans didn't exist during this time period, if you were to have been born in this time period, you would have been wishing you weren't. The Earth was much different hundreds of millions of years ago, with one of the most notable changes being the oxygen level being much higher than it is today. As of right now, the air we breathe is only roughly 21% oxygen, but during the Carboniferous period, the air was 35% oxygen, which sounds great until you remember that oxygen is actually highly flammable, which meant that during this time period where forests were rich and lush, Massive forest fires took place and would rage uncontrollably, sometimes for months or years on end. But that's only the start to some of the Carboniferous shenanigans. Because sure, if you were to be born in this time period, the air alone would cause health issues and would likely cause oxygen toxicity over time, but potentially that's something you could acclimate to. Scientists let me know. But forest fires aside, you would have been faced with some of the most devastating and disgusting creatures of all time. Keep in mind, the Carboniferous period is far before the dinosaurs. So if there was no humans and no dinosaurs, what was roaming the earth? And the answer is insects and arthropods. And these creatures thrived in this oxygen-rich environment, which meant that they could grow to insane sizes. That's right, the Carboniferous period was essentially a time when the entire planet was overrun by huge bugs. There was giant dragonflies that had wingspans that were over 2 feet long. And there was over 3.5 foot long millipedes that would just be crawling around. And these are only 2 examples of some of the creatures that existed during this time. This time period is also known as the Golden Age of Sharks, which as a human means that it's definitely not the Golden Age for you, which is just another reason why this entire period of time would be horrible to be a human, or alive as a human for that matter. But in case the prosperity of sharks and giant bugs weren't enough to kind of creep you out, there was also mega arachne, because of course there was. And what that means is there was giant spiders. Spiders that got as big as a human head, which, I mean, I guess comparably to the size of the other animals I discussed isn't that big, but I mean, I don't want to touch any spider, let alone a spider the size of my head. Even though the Carboniferous period likely would have been extremely beautiful with the rich oxygen causing lush rainforests and greenery to thrive globally, due to the residents of the earth at this time, you would have definitely not wanted to experience it. But I'm curious, out of everything I discussed in this video, which time do you think was the absolute worst and why? Let me know in the comments below. And if you guys loved this video and this concept, I'd be more than happy to make a second part, because while researching for this video, I found a plethora of horrible times to exist as a human. And I had to leave some on the chopping block because I can't make a video that's, 2 hours long. But I can make follow-ups if you guys want it. And with that being said, if you enjoyed this video, check out the video on screen right now. It's a video about how you would die on every planet in our solar system. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, trust me, bro. Dumb rules that exist for smart reasons. The sliced bread ban. I know, shocking, right? I didn't believe it when I heard it either. Mainly because every time you hear about sliced bread, it's always within the context of how amazing it is. Which I find a bit ironic because it seems like most people hold the invention of sliced bread in higher regard than the invention of actual bread. The food that literally sustained humanity for generations. That's besides the point. When sliced bread came out, it was one of the biggest inventions of all time, at least according to catchphrases. But did you know that there was a period of history, albeit brief, where the United States government literally banned sliced bread? Let me explain. The entire sliced bread saga dates all the way back to 1912, when a man named Otto Frederick Rohwedder created the first prototype for an automatic bread slicer. Although this prototype would stay exactly that for a few years. And unfortunately, only 5 years later in 1917, a fire at his warehouse not only destroyed his bread slicing prototype, but also destroyed all of the documentation around it. That includes the blueprints, the spare parts, the other versions he was working on. Literally everything associated with this initial prototype was destroyed in a fire, delaying one of the best inventions of all time by another decade. 11 years later in 1928, with the help from the Chillicothe Baking Company in Missouri, Otto's invention was finally able to get picked up off the ground. Not only were they beginning to use this prototype machine, but they also claimed, quote, this was the greatest step forward in the baking industry since bread was wrapped. Meaning that even back then, nearly 100 years ago, people were so enthusiastic about bread innovation. The start of the sliced bread craze was slow, but after a few years and many large-scale marketing campaigns, sliced bread was a household staple by the 1930s. And by the late 1930s, it was a necessity in every household. And it was also around this time when Wonder Bread was invented. The bread that literally looks like printer paper. But of course, this video isn't about the history of bread, and we've already discussed what the dumb rule was, so what was the smart reason for this weird ban? And without giving too much away, let me just say that this ban took place in 1943, a time when World War II was in full effect, and the United States of America was heavily involved. It shouldn't come as a surprise that during World War II, rations were a way of life to ensure that there was proper availability and supply chain to supply our troops overseas with everything they needed to, in this case, kick some Nazi butt. But these rations came with a price. Besides the inherent restricted lifestyle experienced by everyday Americans, there was also frequent unexpected shortages. For example, sugar or rubber tires running in short supply. And it was because of this that the American government was becoming more and more anxious about not having the proper supplies or supply chain to fund one of the most important wars of all time. And it was actually this anxiety that led to the banning of sliced bread. On January 18th, 1943, Claude R. Wickard, the head of the War Foods Administration, declared that selling sliced bread was illegal. His rationale for this was because sliced bread required thicker wrapping paper to stay fresh. And he argued with the banning of sliced bread that more wax paper would be available, once again, for the troops overseas. But not only would we save wax paper, but we would save steel that would otherwise go to the production of new bread slicing machines. Now, admittedly, I can kind of see both sides of this, because A, this definitely sucks and seems extremely arbitrary, and I feel like there's other corners to be cut. But at the same end, when you are literally fighting in World War II, I think there is no better expression than desperate times call for desperate measures. But with that being said, this ban on sliced bread was definitely not met with acceptance, and almost instantly there was public outrage, specifically among housewives in America, who at this time in many cases were expected to be not only single parents, homemakers, and also full-time factory workers to ensure that the labor force didn't collapse. When these women learned that one of their newest luxuries was going to be taken away from them, they were understandably upset. And there was even a famous quote that was written in a letter to the New York Times only a week after the ban took place. The quote goes as such: "I should like to let you know how important sliced bread is to the morale and the saneness of a household. My husband and 4 children are all in a rush during and after breakfast. Without ready sliced bread, I must do the slicing for toast, 2 pieces each. That's 10. For their lunches, I must cut by hand at least 20 slices for 2 sandwiches apiece. Afterwards, I make my own toast. That's 22 slices of bread to cut in a hurry." That is only one example from one woman, but it paints a picture of how the American people were feeling at this time, coupling not only the annoyance of sliced bread being banned, but also all of the other rations taking place and a literal world war happening overseas. And it was because of all of the public outcry that only 3 months after the ban was introduced, the ban was appealed and sliced bread was once again legal in the United States. I wanted to add this entry very first on the list because I thought the concept of sliced bread being banned was so funny. And while I think we can all agree that this was definitely a dumb rule, I would hope that at least most of us could agree that there was definitely a good reason for this rule. Specifically, doing everything humanly possible to ensure that the Americans and the Allies destroy one of the most evil regimes to ever exist. But let's keep moving. The bear wrestling ban. This rule is dumb not because it seems nonsensical or arbitrary, but because why is this rule even required? Anybody with half a brain and potentially somebody with even a quarter of a brain would understand not to wrestle a bear, right? Well, apparently not people in Alabama in the 1970s. Let me explain. I don't know about you, but when I first read this ban, I instantly envisioned a person walking into the woods, finding a bear randomly, and then wrestling it. But that is not at all what was happening and not what caused this ban whatsoever. The good reason behind this seemingly obvious rule is actually pretty upsetting. During the 1970s, 80s, and even 1990s, bear wrestling was an extremely popular part of circus culture in the United States. And it's also no surprise that these animals are typically not treated well. But potentially one of the poorest treated animals in the entire show was the bear, specifically meant for wrestling. Just for a moment, imagine you're the leader of a circus and you want to have a spectacular bear wrestling act in your circus. How do you go about achieving this safely? Do you A, scrap the idea because this seems unsafe and immoral? B, train a bear to wrestle safely so it can put on a show but also keep your performer safe? Or C, torture, drug, and mutilate the bear until the point that it is so limp and brain dead that literally anybody with a pulse could wrestle it successfully? The answer is obviously C, and that's exactly what happened. Ringleaders knew that they couldn't risk having their talent hurt or killed because that would affect profits. And they also knew that training a bear would take too long. So the porridge that was just right was to literally feed the bear a consistent chemical cocktail to keep them subdued, remove their teeth and claws so they had no opportunity to fight back, and on top of both of these things, consistently torture the bear and keep them malnourished in between shows so that the bear is consistently weak and in a state of fear, meaning that it would rather cower than actually fight back. And one of the most disgusting examples of profiteering off this act was not only having circus staff wrestle these bears for a show, but they would actually sell people in the crowd access to wrestle the bear to look tough. And you just know if that a ringleader felt so confident to have anybody at the circus wrestle their bear, they were messing up the bear so much that there was no way it could hurt anybody. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying these bears should have killed fans or circus employees. I'm just saying they shouldn't have been there in the first place. And that's not even mentioning the extremely questionable questionable methods the circuses used to acquire these bears. And of course, these bear wrestling matches didn't just happen once or twice. They were so prevalent that states had to create their own laws banning them. For example, Alabama made bear wrestling a Class B felony, and this law passed only in 1996, after a lot of the damage was already done. But I guess better late than never. But interestingly, this law was repealed a decade ago in 2015, not because they wanted to bring back bear wrestling, but because the law was no longer necessary. Circus culture had died down significantly, and bear wrestling was officially a thing of the past. And quite frankly, this law was more or less of a publicity stunt than a traditional piece of legislation. Obviously, this was an enforceable felony, although it was stated that the creation of this law was more or less of an act aimed to support animal welfare and public safety. But yeah, upon a first listen, hearing that wrestling bears is now banned seems redundant and weird. But when you actually learn the story of it, it makes total sense. The dissection debate. This is actually the first rule we're going to discuss that doesn't ban something, it actually allows something. But be warned, this one is pretty morbid. The dumb rule that is in play here is known as the Autonomy Act of 1832, and this rule states that doctors, teachers, and medical students in Britain can legally dissect the bodies of unclaimed dead from workhouses, prisons, and hospitals. Upon a first listen, that not only sounds dumb, but also sounds pretty immoral. Like, just think about it. If somebody dies in prison or in a hospital, and they can't find a living family member, which it probably wasn't easy to find a living family member in 1832, the body was essentially just up for grabs to any doctor, teacher, or medical student. That to me sounds like a slippery slope and a lot of room for a lot of malpractice, to say the least. But believe it or not, this dark and dumb rule actually saved a lot of lives. See, prior to the Autonomy Act, the only way that doctors, teachers, and medical students could dissect a body was if the government gave these individuals the body of an executed criminal. This, for a long time, was standard practice. Somebody breaks the law, they get killed for it, and the body gets essentially donated to science. But issues began to rise when in the 18th and 19th centuries, medical schools needed more and more cadavers to not only teach, but learn more about the human anatomy. And it was with this rise of education and bodily exploration that the supply of these bodies were nowhere near the demand. And unfortunately, this gap in the market led to some very unethical practices. One of the main side hustles that was born out of this shortage was something known as body snatching. And it would go a little something like this. If you were a poor individual living in the slums of London and needed to get a few bucks, an easy way for you to get some quick cash is to take a shovel, wait till it's nighttime, and then go to the nearest graveyard. Dig up any body that was freshly buried and take it to any of the local universities. You know that these universities have money, and you know that they need bodies. So a lot of these universities were, at this point in time, willing to pay cash money for bodies, no questions asked. And it only got worse when people decided that they could optimize on this strategy. And by that, I mean that these body snatchers decided that they would just cut out the middleman. Why go dig up a dead body if you could just make a dead body? And by that, I mean people would literally just kill people and then take the body of their murdered victim directly to the university for cash money. This was more or less of the peak of body snatching. And when this specific story broke and spread across all of Britain, the government knew they had to do something. And it was at that exact moment when the Autonomy Act of 1832 was established. So while it may seem odd that any unclaimed undesirable can just be donated to science against their will, I think the rule makes a lot more sense once you realize that a lack of bodies was not only creating a scientific bottleneck, but was also creating a nationwide trend of grave robbing and eventually murder. This dumb and morbid law actually had a pretty good reason, especially considering the time frame. Like in the 1800s, there was nowhere near the medical standards that there are today. Okay, this is off topic, but do you smell that? It smells like you didn't shower. And if that's the case, I feel bad for your anime body pillow. But in case you did, you're obviously not using the right stuff, which is why this video is sponsored by Cheeky Soap. Cheeky Soap is my favorite soap company by far, and it was actually founded by this guy.
Hey, Brody.
Over the last year, I got absolutely obsessed with bar soap, but I quickly ran into one major problem. Almost every bar soap that I tried left my sensitive skin feeling dry. It was for this reason that when I first tried Cheeky, I was so impressed that it didn't only smell good, but it literally left my skin feeling moisturized after just one shower, which is why I was so eager to partner with them when they asked me. Not only do they have an amazing handful of core scents in their collection, but on top of that, Cheeky even told me that if we're able to get enough support, they are willing to make a custom Trust Me Bro soap bar. So if you've never tried bar soap before, or you use bar soap and are looking for something new, I would definitely recommend giving Cheeky a try using my link in the description to not only get a discount, but to help support the channel. Click the link in the description, use my code, and get the starter bundle today to upgrade your showers. I guarantee you will not be looking back. Now, let's get back to the video. The tiger selfie ban. Yep, we're back to animal bans. But this one is really peculiar. In 2014, the state of New York effectively put a ban on taking selfies with tigers and any other big cats. I think to most of us, that sounds pretty dumb. But the reason why they did this makes a lot of sense, and it's actually quite short. The government of New York was getting so many copyright complaints from tigers from people who were taking pictures of them and selling them without giving proceeds to the tigers. And because the government of New York did not want to deal with any more lawsuits from tigers over copyright disputes, they decided to outright ban selfies altogether. That was obviously a total lie, I just made it up. Here's the real scoop. New York didn't necessarily ban taking selfies with tigers. What they did do was specifically ban any member of the public being near any dangerous animal in a circus, zoo, or carnival that is not in a safe and confined cage. And while it may seem like I'm reaching here, the purpose of this ban, keeping people and dangerous animals separated, was specifically inspired by the rise of tiger selfies. During the early 2010s, the dating app Tinder saw a massive surge of men on the platform using pictures of themselves next to tigers as one of their profile photos. And this trend was so prevalent, in fact, that the Wall Street Journal estimates that 1 out of 10 people had a photo with a tiger on their Tinder. Obviously, these men wanted to seem tough and adventurous, but in reality, all they were doing in most cases was contributing to animal exploitation. And when this was all brought to the state of New York, they not only recognized it, but sought to put an end to it. And how they went about it was, of course, the tiger selfie ban. Because no, you can't ban taking a picture with an animal, but you can ban people from being around these dangerous animals. And this ban was pretty effective, considering the New York government knew that all these men that were taking these pictures to look tough knew that they wouldn't look nearly as tough if the tiger was in a cage behind them. And this ban was honestly pretty genius, because these people that were taking pictures with tigers and lions to look tough wouldn't want to have photos of them with a tiger in a cage, because then they wouldn't look tough at all. It would just look like they're taking a selfie at the zoo, completely nullifying the trend, helping mitigate animal exploitation. Similar to the ban of bear wrestling, tigers or lions or jaguars or any big cats that were specifically used for photo ops were not well taken care of in the slightest. A lot of these poor cats were bought young, taken away from their mothers, and for basically all of their life treated poorly and used as a toy and a means to earn profit. When this trend was on the rise in the early 2010s, people were booking all kinds of big cat experiences. Tiger kitten play date, tiger kitten photo op, lion photo op, have a lion at your wedding. Anything you could have imagined, people were buying lions specifically with the purpose of pimping them out at public events to have them look cool. And obviously, if you're bringing a big cat to a public setting, the cat has to be extremely subdued, or in some cases, tortured, malnourished, declawed, defanged, drugged, and the like. And if you ever watched that documentary Tiger King, then you kind of get the idea of the dark business behind the whole big cat picture industry. And just like how Alabama wanted to stop the exploitation of bears, New York sought to stop the exploitation of big cats, which they did with their 2014 tiger selfie ban. A seemingly dumb rule with, in my opinion, a pretty smart plan of attack. The kitty cat cigarette ban. Okay, I swear, this video isn't a Trojan horse for me to get on my vegan soapbox talking about animal cruelty. But coincidentally, there has been a lot of interesting laws surrounding animals, but for the sake of repetition, I'll keep this one brief. Similar to the second law we discussed, this ban isn't dumb because it seems arbitrary, it just seems extremely, well, redundant and nonsensical. The ban I'm specifically referring to is the ban that Illinois placed on handing your pet a nicotine stick. To put it bluntly, in Illinois, it is explicitly stated that it is illegal to, quote, give a lit cigar or cigarette to a cat, dog, or other domestic pet, including ball python. And that's essentially the entire law. You cannot give a lit cigar or cigarette to your cat, dog, domestic pet, or explicitly stated ball python, because of course everybody's giving a lit cigar to their ball python. It's reported that this law comes from the early 1800s and by today's standards is relatively outdated, which I would agree with. But I wanted to mention it quickly because it, more than anything, just kind of sounded funny. And also just makes you think, how often was this happening if the state of Illinois had to not only recognize it, but ban it? Obviously, the good reason behind this dumb law is to prevent pets from unintentionally burning themselves or even setting themselves on fire or potentially even trying to smoke and getting addicted. It was believed that this law was put into place as a general effort to prevent animal cruelty, which is obviously something that's completely reasonable. Although this law is just kind of notable and in my opinion hilarious because of how specific it is. The fact that legislators in Illinois had to explicitly exclaim and write with a quill in ink that no lit cigar or cigarette shall be given to any domestic pet, including cats, dogs, hamsters, and ball pythons, to me is hilarious and noteworthy, and we're gonna move on, but I just wanted to share it. And if you were curious, yes, this law is still active today. The no spitting sanction. First and foremost, get your mind out of the gutter. Now let's move on. I think we can all agree that if you see somebody walking down the road just spitting on the sidewalk, it's definitely not polite and pretty gross. But is it something that's worthy of a ban? Well, unless it becomes some sort of national trend, I don't see it as something worthy of government intervention. However, there was a time when the United States government decided that it was in their best interest to ban any form of spitting in any public area. And this wasn't one of those obscure laws with a deeper meaning like some of the other ones we've discussed. discussed. No, this was a straightforward law that was not only written and passed, but also had signs placed everywhere reminding individuals and also had strict enforcement. But the question remains, what was the smart reasoning behind this dumb rule? And the answer, as some of you might have guessed, is health related. During 1918, during the last year of World War I, many cities across the United States were dealing with a major Spanish flu pandemic. This pandemic was extremely deadly, and the spread of this disease was seemingly never ending, which is why the US government was pretty desperate to do anything that could potentially stop the spread. During the time of the Spanish flu, over a century ago, health officials believed that diseases like influenza and tuberculosis were spread through saliva droplets. And it was because of this belief that they held that would later essentially be found true, they decided that their best course of action to help prevent the spread would be to minimize the creation of saliva droplets, which meant no spitting, specifically in any public place. Sidewalks, trains, theaters, anywhere. If you were caught spitting, you would be fined and potentially even arrested, which is just crazy to think about now. But during 1918, during the Spanish flu pandemic, I wouldn't want to even be in a public place, let alone spitting in one. Making this seemingly dumb rule make a lot more sense with context. And speaking of context, let me give you guys some context about how many of you are actually subscribed. YouTube literally tells me that over 75% of you watching this right now aren't subscribed. So I just wanted to say, if you're enjoying this video or even watch me regularly, consider hitting the subscribe button and being a bro. I post new videos every single Friday, and we are currently on the road to 1 million subscribers. Oh, and if you like this topic of dumb rules with smart reasons, simply leave a like or leave a comment below telling me you want a part 2. I love making the videos that you guys want, so if you want a part 2, let me know and I'd be more than happy to make it. But now, let's get to the final entry on this list. The bubblegum ban. Chances are, if you've heard of any of the dumb rules on this list, it's this one. And that's because this country's gum ban is extremely infamous. And I would actually bet money that you know the country that has this gum ban. And if you guess Singapore, you'd be right. The whole bubblegum ban in Singapore is regarded as one of those dumb laws or arbitrary laws, but the actual history behind this bubblegum ban is very much so rooted in the history and culture of Singapore. And in my opinion, has some pretty good reasoning behind it. The origins of this ban date back to 1959. When Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, took office. Lee Kuan Yew is considered the founding father of modern-day Singapore, and it's said that his political leadership is what transformed post-independent Singapore into a highly developed country in the major global hub that it is today. Lee Kuan Yew was literally Prime Minister from 1959 until 1990. That is a major run as Prime Minister. But for 2 years before and after he was Prime Minister, he was also the Secretary General for the People's Action Party. To put it bluntly, this guy was invested in the success of Singapore. But I want to make it clear that I'm not necessarily advocating for Lee whatsoever. Like any politician or any person, there is both good and bad that must be recognized. And with any multi-decade long run as Prime Minister, there's definitely some questionable things that go on. For example, from 1968 to 1981, Singapore, under the control of Lee, instated a one-party state. And because of this, he employed defamation laws and detention without trial, as well as other propaganda and social engineering techniques to continue his political success. So just keep that in mind. I'm not necessarily vouching for this guy. I'm just trying to unbiasedly state facts about the country. And two of the virtues that Lee held nearest and dearest to his heart was independence and cleanliness. And Lee has even gone on record to state that his goal when he became the Prime Minister of Singapore in 1965 was to, quote, create a first world oasis in a third world region. And he wanted to do so through hyper-independence and, of course, cleanliness. The gum ban specifically was introduced in 1992. It was done so for a plethora of pretty practical reasons. On top of Lee's personal desire to keep the country as clean as possible, chewing gum was actually becoming quite a bit of a nuisance within Singapore specifically. Gum wrappers were littering the streets, chewed gum was stuck on any surface you could imagine, and most notably in the late 1980s, when Singapore launched its Mass Rapid Transit or MTR subway system, vandals began to place chewing gum on the sensors of the train doors, causing them to not open or not close when they should have. And this vandalism at scale caused major subway delays, affecting the lives upon thousands and thousands of Singaporeans. And it was this stunt that broke the camel's back and officially led to the banning of chewing gum. But like everything else they've mentioned, it goes a bit deeper than that. Because this ban on chewing gum isn't just about banning minty fresh breath or keeping the subway system on time. Culturally, this ban signified Singapore's philosophy of having a strict government that enforces strong discipline. And the government saw this chewing gum vandalism as an act of rebellion from its citizens. And with the Singaporean government being as strict as it was and is, they decided that they were not going to play games and they wanted to ban it outright. But this ban was twofold, because sure, they wanted to show their civilians and the world that they ruled with a iron fist, but these acts of vandalism also gave them reason to keep the country that much cleaner. Something that a lot of people don't know is that while gum is banned in Singapore, it's not the only odd thing that's banned. Any form of litter is banned, any form of graffiti is banned, jaywalking is banned, spitting is banned, expelling mucus from your nose is banned, and urinating anywhere that is not a toilet is also banned. Oh, and if you use a public toilet, you are legally required to flush it. And while most of these things are not legal or accepted in other places, it just goes to show that with these specific legal bans, how serious Singapore is about public cleanliness and orderliness. And the chewing gum ban was only an addition of this already ongoing cultural movement. After this seemingly dumb and pretty arbitrary rule was put in place in 1992, many foreign journalists went specifically to Singapore to talk to Lee and question him about the seemingly nonsensical ban. And in every interview, Lee simply defended his point, claiming that you do not take a country from being a struggling country in a quote third world region to being a first world oasis without having strong rules, strong discipline, and ruling with an iron fist. Lee has even gone on record to state, quote, "We were called a nanny state, but the result is that we are today better behaved and we live in a more agreeable place than 30 years ago." And when one reporter tried to press Lee claiming that banning chewing gum could be banning the creativity of some individuals, Lee simply said, quote, "If you can't think because you can't chew, try a banana." I have no personal opinion on Lee or the country of Singapore, and I personally don't think I'd want to live in a country with such strict rules. Although it's hard to argue against the political career of Lee and the success that Singapore has had in such a short period of time as a result of some of these seemingly dumb rules. And I'm curious to know what you guys think in the comments below. And I guess with that being said, if you enjoyed this video, check out the video on screen right now. It's a video I made about facts that everybody believes that are actually total lies. And believe me when I say, there's a lot of crazy things that most people still believe that are in no way, shape, or form true. Thank you, bros, so much for watching. And as always, trust me, bro.
How would you describe a ninja? I don't know, probably black hood, black robes, samurai sword, something like that. Oh yeah, cool. What if I told you were completely wrong and that was completely stupid? Well, I'd feel like a dumbass. Well, you sure look like one, but don't worry. In this video, I'm going to explain and debunk some very common historical misconceptions. So like I was just explaining to my friend, the way that we commonly imagine ninjas is almost completely inaccurate to the way that they actually looked. Ninjas looked nothing like that, and there was no such thing as a ninja uniform at all. Ninjas typically wore civilian clothing to blend in with everyone else. If you think about it, it makes sense to look like everyone else so they wouldn't draw attention to themselves. Walking around in an all-black hooded outfit with a sword on your back would probably cause some suspicion. Even during nighttime operations, ninjas would wear navy blue, not black. 1, to hide the stains of blood better. 2, because the navy blue would actually blend into the night sky better than black would. Ninjas were spies, assassins, covert agents, and their ultimate goal and specialty was to hide in plain sight. So the next time a kid comes to your door on Halloween dressed up as a historically inaccurate ninja, make sure you let him know that, hey, you don't look like a ninja, you look like a dummy, and you're not getting any candy, pajama kid. The next misconception is that people only live to be like 30 in the Middle Ages. That's not true at all. It is an accurate statement to say the life expectancy was shorter in the Middle Ages, however, not nearly as much shorter as you may think. For example, a fully grown, healthy 21-year-old man in medieval times could be expected to live all the way to the age of 64, which isn't necessarily super old, but definitely not, dying in your 30s or 40s. The largest reason for this misconception and common discrepancy is the fact that infant mortality in the Middle Ages was just so high, which is a problem we almost don't have anymore. With modern medicine and technological advances, the infant mortality rate, fortunately, is extremely low nowadays. But in the medieval times, if 50% of people are dying before they hit 1 year old, obviously the average life expectancy is going to be lower overall. Our third misconception that I personally remember hearing vividly as a child was that if you drop a penny off the Empire State Building and it lands on someone, it will kill them. This is completely false. Without getting too much into detail, let's just go over some simple numbers. For starters, a penny itself only weighs 2.5 grams. With the height that the penny would fall from the Empire State Building, it would have the opportunity to achieve terminal velocity. However, adjusting for wind resistance and air friction would only allow this to really reach anywhere from 30 to 100 miles per hour. Which you might be thinking, 100 miles per hour? Damn, that's gonna kill me. Well, no, because you have to think about the energy expenditure once it impacts. It takes roughly 68 joules of power to be able to fracture a human skull. That means anything with a force higher than 68 joules has a high probability of killing you if it impacts with your skull. Now, for context, a raindrop with its tiny mass at terminal velocity will only have 0.002 joules of kinetic energy, and a penny at terminal velocity will only have about 0.2 joules. So, although you may have heard, and it may seem that a metal object at terminal velocity could easily kill you, that's simply not the case, at least with a penny. So the next time you're up in a high building, throw all the change you can over the edge. It's completely safe, it's fun, and nobody will get mad at you. And if someone does get mad, just do what that really annoying kid in school would do. Just say, "It's a free country. It's a free country. I can do what I want. It's a free country." Nobody thinks that's annoying. It's honestly great. Number 4. Benjamin Franklin did not invent or discover electricity. At some point, you probably heard the story of Benjamin Franklin tying a key to a kite and going out in a thunderstorm. Now, this story alone is already debated on when or if it ever even happened, but that's not what I'm focusing on. My focus is on the claim that Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity. Right off the bat, one thing to make very clear is that nobody invented electricity. It seems pretty obvious, but just to clear the air, electricity is a natural force that exists in this world. Therefore, it is not invented, it is simply discovered. A bit of a nitpick, but worth mentioning. Now, to give credit where credit is due, Benjamin Franklin had one of the greatest scientific minds of his time. He was interested in many areas of science, made many discoveries, and even invented many things, including bifocal glasses. But he was not the first to discover electricity. Egyptian scholars wrote in text in 2750 BC referring to electric fish, known as the thunders of the Nile, and several Mediterranean cultures were aware of static electricity. The first proper electric study was conducted in the 1600s by English scientist William Gilbert, who actually coined the term electricity. Benjamin Franklin had numerous contributions in the field of electricity, notably demonstrating the electric nature of lightning with his key experiment, but he was not the first to discover it. This next one honestly blows my mind. People still believe that WWE is fake when it's obviously real. Like, just look at John Cena. He's real. He's as real as it gets. What do you think he's been doing for the last 20 years? Just faking it? Just doing nothing? Why do you think Fred would have John Cena in his movie if he was just a big phony? This is just complete lunacy. And even though it's modern history, it's still history and it's still real. Okay. Have you seen this painting? This is American Gothic by Grant Wood. And if you look at it, what do you see? A man, a woman, a pitchfork, a house, a barn. Now, if you're like most people, you probably assumed, oh, this is a husband and wife. Well, actually, no. This is a daughter and father. So now you just look creepy. Completely off topic, but just kind of interesting was how this painting even came to be in the first place. The only reason this painting exists is because Grant Wood, the original painter of the painting, saw this house that he was so inspired by that he said, I want to paint the people that probably would have lived here. And the people that modeled for the painting aren't even related. The woman in the painting is Grant's sister, and the man is their family dentist, which is so funny, but kind of interesting. Okay, so this next one makes a lot of sense, but I've just never thought about it. Ancient Greek and Roman sculptures were actually originally painted with color. They only appear white today because the original pigments have just deteriorated. There are some well-preserved statues that still have traces of their original color, but it is extremely rare. Think about it. Your 2006 Honda Civic has paint falling off. You think the pigments of 2,000 years ago are going to last forever? No. Speaking of things you can't see anymore, Helen Keller was famous for being a great speaker because of her limitations, right? If you do some research on her, or maybe if you just have some peripheral knowledge, that's probably what you understand. But actually, Helen was a great proponent of socialism and communism. She spoke mostly on workers and women's rights, and she advocated for an American communist government. I just find this misconception quite interesting because a lot of information about Helen Keller has nothing to do with this, but this is the primary reason why she gained public popularity. Obviously, her story is motivational, and she was very well spoken for someone in her situation, but the majority of her initial content was all about communism, which is just so interesting that that's not talked about. Whether you support or don't support communism, I feel like this is just interesting that this fact is just left out. And she's just seen as, oh yeah, she was a great motivational speaker. Well, what did you talk about? And ladies and gentlemen, the last thing that I want to talk about is not communism. It is our last historical misconception. This misconception is that chastity belts were a medieval thing. Chastity belts were not a medieval thing at all. They didn't even exist back then. Also, a lot of medieval chastity belts that have been found are either complete fakes or anti-masturbation devices from the 19th to 20th century, when there was a widespread belief that masturbation could lead to insanity. In 1878, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, yes, that Kellogg, the creator of cornflakes, he was an advocate for complete abstinence of all kinds. There is literally a quote from John Kellogg that goes as follows: "Neither the plague, nor war, nor smallpox, nor similar diseases have produced results so disastrous to humanity as the habit of masturbation." All I'm saying is I think Johnny Boy should stick to cereal. And with that being said, I would love to hear from you guys. How many of these misconceptions have you heard of? And how many of these did you actually believe before watching this video? Let me know in the comments. And also, if there's any misconceptions that you know the truth about, leave them in the comments below. And who knows, maybe I'll make a part 2. This is my 4th video, and we're dropping brand new videos every single week. So if you enjoy, subscribe. We've got a lot more awesome videos coming up very soon. Trust me, bro.